This is the Kaiser Report. You've heard of neoliberalism, right? The thing Naomi Klein is always whinging on about up there in Canada? Well, apparently she was right. It's
podcast and coffee.
Well, actually, I didn't know how junk it was until I saw some charts, and this is from the Bank of England, this chart. But before I get to the chart, I'm going to read the headline. Neoliberalism
Join me
was
with a
supposed
coffee
to
and a
make the
spliff.
future. 3 reasons why it
And a
didn't.
podcast,
How
the latest
neoliberalism
of Max
contributed
Keiser.
to the productivity
Only
slowdown.
streamed
First
or
I'll show you
recorded
this Bank
3
of
hours
England
ago.
Data. That is 20-year annualized productivity growth since 1800. You notice since 1971,
I need a reset suddenly.
has declined. This is that whole post-World War II period when everybody, America became the great shine.
the U.S. went off the gold standard.
The article does not actually point that out, but over and over and over
Special
again,
effects.
so many charts, and they always say correlation does not equal causation necessarily. But you look at
That's how we
income,
go in the
for
new
example,
century.
Male American income.
The new age.
1971 was the peak, then it declines. From
Yeah, look at income.
Mango
If, in
haze.
fact, the same grams of gold you could get per hour of work in 1971 were applied today, hourly wages in America would be $63 per hour, not $7, $8, $9, $15 an hour. That loss of purchasing power is why you have a expanding lower class, a diminishing middle class, and a wealth and income gap, or Gini coefficient, to use an IMF term, catastrophe.
Just have some
Now-
film, eh?
Part of the
Catastrophe on
inspiration
the way,
for this
yes.
guy writing this piece is somebody wrote a glowing piece about Margaret Thatcher and how her privatization and how she brought in privatization and that this has somehow been a boon to the UK economy. This guy is responding to that. Of course, that privatization that started under Reagan and Thatcher would not have been possible under a gold standard because, of course, you don't want to go bankrupt, because if all your income is going out of the country, and we know that most of it used to be the national rail.
Hello, welcome in the Sativa room. Do you have an opinion about Max Keiser? Is he going to change the world?
They extract the rent. They take the income stream from that.
Do join
They
me
pay
with a
their
spliff
pensioners
and a
their own
coffee.
service. But if the UK
And,
were on a gold standard, that of course they would be bleeding gold instead of just.
It's the latest Max Keiser
Plus,
report.
Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had the benefit of making economic policies with impunity. In other words, every single mistake that they made were papered over by a rising bond market, or the inverse of this being a lower interest rate market. So with every catastrophe, you could simply defer the consequences to the future. And we're still into the 35-year bull market in bonds.
Well, you might say that also matches with that. About at that little wobble there, that's when the bond market bull has started. So by it being so easy to make mistakes and cover it up, everybody got lazy. You can think of it that way. There was no cost or consequence to your lack of innovation.
We're
your lack
living
of
in a central bank petting zoo. Now, if animals in the zoo, they get lazy. They don't want to be lazy. But they get lazy because after a few months, after a few years, they get fed on a regular basis. They don't have to go out there and hunt. They don't have to compete. They get lazy, they get fat, they get sick, they die. Interest rates being at artificially low rates mean that a big portion of the economy is lazy. In the UK and in the United States, they don't have to compete, they don't have to go out there and hunt. When they make a mistake, they just get a big bailout from the central banks who are happy to give them that money because they get paid on the amount of money they give away. It's the Hollywood business model. You just get paid on the size of the budget. You don't get paid on whether the movie makes money or not. You just get paid on how big the budget is. That's how bankers get paid, how many bonds they can sell. Doesn't matter if those bonds are economically justified at all. Doesn't matter if it grows the economy at all. They just get paid based on the size of the bonds that they float. And as a result, you have a disproportionate amount of capital allocated to the least productive
I am an
aspect of
alien light
society,
being.
Wall Street and City of London bankers.
Yeah. Now, he
Alien
he
light
dismisses
being.
privatization as being anything that good that happened. So he says that the thing is that privatization isn't the only thing to have happened since the 1980s. which should have raised productivity, according to what I'll loosely call neoliberal ideology. Trade unions have weakened, which should have reduced restrictive practices, according to neoliberal ideology. Managers have become better paid, which should have attracted more skillful ones, and better incentivized them to increase productivity. And the workforce has more human capital. Since the mid-'80s, the proportion of workers with a degree has quadrupled from 8% to 1/3, and yet our productivity is declining. And if your productivity is declining, your wealth is
Yeah, buy my blues.
so there's why despite all of that happening, that the neoliberal ideologists say this is supposed to be good, and all the people in the Beltway media telling the voters out in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Iowa that they voted wrong because we promise one day this will all be good. This TPP will somehow be good for you. We're doubling down on this collapse of productivity.
Look, there's a saying that capital seeks where it gets the highest rate of return. And capital is free to do that around the world. However, humans are not. You know, all the jobs went to China, all the jobs went to overseas. And yet, the immigration problem, the walls being erected between Mexico and America or between other areas, that humans are kept in these capitalist petting zoos of free lunches, essentially. They turn lazy, sick, and die. Capital, however, is free to roam, free to compete, free to engorge itself on the lush land of financialization. And we now have this emerging problem of the algorithms that are driving the markets have spawned robots that are now taking all the jobs. And so this productivity curve in terms of humans will continue to deteriorate. But as far as robots go, you even have people like, Bill Gates suggesting that the robots that are replacing jobs should pay taxes. So here's someone who is completely disconnected from the plight of the millions and millions he claims to be helping at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation by now ascribing human-like qualities to the robots who should be paying taxes. It doesn't matter if he's he's the kind of guy that will wipe out the entire indigenous nation in America to put up a few Starbucks and claim that this is somehow progress.
So this guy, Chris Dillo, also says another mechanism of what's causing, what could be causing, he's suggesting a hypothesis of what is causing this decline in productivity, is that the inequality, the rising inequality that, by the way, the neoliberals and the neoconservatives and the Beltway sorts, the Hillary Clintons and most of the establishment Republicans believe that inequality is good because it causes people to strive harder to make those become part of that administrative
I know I'm not a
class.
beautiful woman with nice tits and all, but
that's a good model for the economy at large.
Well,
Yeah.
actually, that's part of this story, this bit here, because he says that inequality can reduce productivity. For example, it generates distrust, which depresses growth by worsening the quality of policy, exacerbating markets for lemons problems, and by diverting resources towards low productivity guard labor. So you have a lot of resentful people.
don't work.
You need to have prison guards.
You
You
like
need
me.
to protect your property. You need to hire. Need to go into
Blah, blah,
gated
blah.
communities. So it doesn't add any wealth to your economy. You're not creating value. You're just
I create
guarding
wealth. I
some
make
people
music.
Who have rigged the system to
I grow
basically, you can look at that decline in
blah, blah.
productivity as also like a funnel into certain pockets.
Well, we were talking to Carl Denninger about this. I think there's a connection to be made with the velocity of money. Money turnover is still shrinking in America because the banks are hoarding the cash and they're not giving it to Visa to the economy via higher wages, which would increase spending. That would be GDP would go up. And then your productivity, which is a function of GDP, would start to look good. But as long as wages are stagnant to falling and all that money is hoarded, you're never going to get a productivity gain.
And he also mentions something, basically the Soviet problem. He doesn't call it the Soviet problem, but he says good management can be bad for investment and innovation.
Yes,
because
but
the managers are focused on
everything
those
is
little
bad.
boxes that they have to tick. You have to meet this deadline, and it's
all
all about
bad.
meeting that deadline. So nobody has time
all
to
going
innovate
to hell.
or think of new ideas. So that's something that the Soviet Union was quite good at meeting targets, and the whole thing collapsed around them. But this is one that you often talk about, and this is the managerial class under neoliberalism has been richly rewarded. If you get there, your incomes have gone up many-fold, and that's part of the wealth and income gap that has arisen, is that they get paid way more than they used to, and the bottom 99% get paid less. But the high-powered incentives offered to bosses can backfire. They can incentivize rent-seeking, office politics, and jockeying for the top job rather than getting on with one's work. They can crowd out intrinsic motivations such as professional pride. Of course, intrinsic professional pride, that sort of stuff, intrinsic motivations are not part of our equation for sure. Hollywood will say you only will do it for money. Artists will create, people don't have pride. That's like Margaret Thatcher's, there's no such thing as society. There's no such thing as pride or dignity. It's all about money.
Well, if Tom Brady, 5-time Super Bowl champion with the New England Patriots, quarterback, he was also the referee on the field, would that be an interesting game? Probably not. He would just call himself all the time. He would call penalties against the other team all the time. He'd walk over to the end zone, score touchdowns, and nobody would watch that game. So when you have bankers who use their ill-gotten gains to buy Washington, to buy regulators, to buy politicians, you end up with the sorry state of non-competition. The biggest problem in the American economy right now is the lack of competition.
Yes, you see it in everything. We've talked about Obamacare. We've talked about the fact that you can only get one health insurance company in an area. I saw a friend of mine just moved back to Chicago from Florida, and he's complaining that there's only one internet company in the area, and it's really expensive and it's super slow quality. Right here in this research triangle, Google Fiber is coming in. Thank God.
It's a whole different ball game with some music, eh?
All the other companies have to increase it. They're trying to block Google Fiber from even entering the market. So it's that rent-seeking thing. If you don't want competition, that's the fact. Is these heads of these companies do not want competition because competition destroys their rent-seeking and their profits.
Well, I mean, like in the case of this show, for example, there have been folks trying to compete, but as they try to compete, we just get better and better. And the ability to compete with us gets further and further away. It's like, you know, at the beach with a beach ball, you try to get that beach ball, but you're pushing it further and further away. You can't do it. It's impossible. It's on a Mobius strip of excellence. It'll never happen. Don't even try. We're untouchable.
Yeah.
Hey, speaking of untouchability, stay right there.
I want to know the newest.
Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Steve Keen. He's the author of Debunking Economics. He's the professor at Kingston University in London. And he's now with a new Patreon page, which you can talk to in a minute. But first, Steve Keen, welcome.
Good to be here, Max.
Now, Professor Keen, you have recently submitted evidence about quantitative easing, or QE, to a Treasury committee in the UK. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, actually, first I've got to doff my cap to the British Parliament because, of course, we should have had tons of inquiries about what caused the financial crisis and that actually did other than a soft job for the Federal Reserve and its friends. That hasn't happened in America, but here on their own volition they've decided to analyse and say, well, how do we do in terms of trying to rescue it using this thing that the Bank of England calls QE. And this may be responding to some pressure being imposed by Positive Money, which is a campaign group here in England that is campaigning for 100% government money creation, taking away the money creation privilege that private banks have. And they've been campaigning for some time saying QE's made things worse, it's increased inequality, it hasn't done much to stimulate the economy. And the parliamentary committee that the parliament that oversees the Treasury has decided to investigate whether QE actually did work and was called for public submission. So good on the English for being willing to hear a different point of view.
Well, they love their inquiries over there in Britain. A little light on actually taking action, and but they love the chin wag for sure. So let's talk about QE and its role in the financial crisis. What was the role there, and why did it go so wrong?
Okay. Well, QE was basically the central banks using the conventional channels they've got to buy bonds off the private sector, either being off private banks, which was the main thing in America, or private non-bank financial institutions, which is injecting money into it, but it's injecting the money through the finance sector. And as you would have heard Michael Hudson say many an occasion, Bernanke's helicopter flew over Wall Street rather than Main Street. So what they were saying is, well, nonetheless, that's where we drop the money. What does it actually do for the real economy? Can you give us any ideas? And what I've done is, as well as looking at the scale of QE, I've looked at the mechanism by which it was done, which is actually buying bonds off, in England, buying bonds off pension companies, superannuation companies, insurance companies, and so on. And then that transfers money or creates money inside their accounts. Now, of course, these are organisations which have the sole role of buying financial assets and then getting a return off that and handing it back to their policy holders and so on. So if you inject, as was the case in England in 1 year, £200 billion worth of money into those organisations, they then go and buy, if you're lucky, £200 billion worth of shares. That then increases the value of shares, hopefully by roughly the same amount, £200 billion up, which means then shareholders, wealthy people who own these shares, who get them sell those shares to the pension funds, insurance companies, and so on, realise the capital gain they get out of it, and then spend some of that money buying goods and services off us players, and the rest, of course, buying other assets like housing. So what I've been able to do with my topic package is lay out this process dynamically and see what's the overall impact of pouring this £200 billion in. And as you might guess, most of the impact goes back into the share market again and back to the property markets, making the wealthy wealthier, throwing a bit of money to the hoi polloi and stimulating the economy a bit that way. But it ends up being for every pound thrown in, you get roughly 50 figures benefit.
Well, we live in a financialized world, Professor Keene. Everything is financialized and traded on an exchange somewhere. As Alan Greenspan noted when he was Federal Reserve Chairman, the global trade is getting lighter as things like the oil market becomes financialized and you have 60,000 barrels of financialized paper oil trading for every barrel of genuine oil. And in the case of the banking sector, what they were able to do was to create a financialization of their fraud. So all the major banks in the UK have been complicit, have been engaged in some form of skullduggery, illegal activity, fraud, mis-selling, etc. But what they did was they packaged that, they financialized it, they created a security of fraud. So fraud was now securitized, and they sold it to the central bank who bought their fraud. So why should anyone be happy? Was the committee, was the inquiry tool that the people of Britain were forcibly forced to buy billions and billions of pounds worth of securitized fraud? Were they told the facts, or was it all based on economic mumbo-jumbo, evasive talk and nonsense, as most of the inquiries are?
Well, in fact, the inquiry, the submissions close on Monday, Max, so they'll be told probably by some of the submittees the arguments like that. But as usual, the usual story is that this is just too nasty a story to be told, therefore we don't believe it on to the next person making the submission. And, none of the claims which were very validly made led to a single prosecution in America, as we both know, and nor did it lead to one in England. So I think they're just going to continue wafting over that. So what I've done instead is say, well, let's actually do a little economic model and see what the impact of QE is. And let's compare that to what you could have got if rather than giving the money to Wall Street, to Long Island Street over here, you gave it directly to the public. And the result that I get back is that if the £200 billion they pumped into the finance sector, which mainly inflated house prices over here and kept share prices rising, they could have got the same bang for their buck in terms of the stimulus it actually made to the real economy by giving £25 billion.
Nee, nu 63 achter elkaar zit.
Given directly to the public would have had the same
Is that
impact
3 times
on
the
the
same thing in a row, eh? Come here, ho,
The economic argument might be more effective than pointing out the obvious fraud that they've managed to ignore for the last decade.
But, Steve, you don't have a Nobel Prize. And Paul Krugman does have a Nobel Prize. And Paul Krugman's solution is take the faulty model that generated only, if I remember what you just said correctly, 50p of economic activity for every pound of QE. Was that what you just said?
Yeah.
Okay, so in other words, Paul Krugman will say, well, to get a full pound of economic activity, let's do 2 pounds worth of quantitative easing. We're not doing enough of the fraud. We need more fraud. That'll be Paul Krugman has stated that in the New York Times hundreds of times. He's a pro-fraud economist, and yet he's got the Nobel Prize. And when you go to an inquiry like this, they look at they look at the prizes. They don't listen to what you're saying. They're economically illiterate. They're just going to base their information on protocol, on status quo, on who went to what school, and they're basically idiots at the end of the day. So they don't listen to anything like 2 + 2 = 4. They want to hear that 2 + 2 equals 5, and they want to justify their fraud, and they want to hear anyone who comes in and justifies their fraud will get a fair hearing. This is the history of inquiries in the UK, whether it's the Iraq War or the financial system. They're just looking to legitimize the fraud, not to get rid of the fraud. That's my point.
In fact, there's a couple of members of this committee who are engineers. That always gives me hope rather than talking to economists. So people who might actually understand the approach that I take, which is very much based on what engineers do it, to model dynamic systems where we land in planes and the wheels don't fall off. We land in economies and they crash all the time because we let engineers design the former and economists design the latter. So I'm hoping the engineers will give me a bit of a hearing. And even, like, I agree with you in general about the nature of inquiries globally. What the English tend to do is rather different to the Americans. The Americans hold an inquiry immediately and exonerate everybody who's guilty. The English hold an inquiry and publish the results 10 years later and say, we should have prosecuted that guy back then, but oh dear, it's a bit too late. If you look at the inquiry into I think the Chilcot inquiry into Blair, of course, it really came out saying, well, you know, the guy basically lied and we were dragged into what we shouldn't have been part of, and all the justifications were invalid, but oh dear, it's a bit late to do anything about it. Now this one, of course, it's now coming up, this is the 10th year after the financial crisis, so maybe it's a similar sort of thing. Oh dear, we should have done something differently.
Well, on the subject of accountants and accountancy, 2 PricewaterhouseCoopers accountants made a mistake and handed the Academy Award the wrong envelope. They've now been barred from working in the industry ever again, and they're getting death threats from people around the world. And yet these big banks and the central bank commit fraud every single day, and accounting fraud. And there's just, how do we make, in other words, the connection to all this accounting and banking fraud is that ultimately people become impoverished, they become homeless, and they die. But how do we get folks to take it seriously? In other words, they don't think they see any consequences to this. They just see it as a bunch of blood. Let's just print more paper. There's no consequences. Nobody gets hurt doing this. How do we make them understand that they're committing, you know, essentially financial genocide?
Well, I think we elect people like Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump, because this is really what's going on. I mean, if these conventional theories of economics actually work, you and I wouldn't have an audience. We wouldn't even have a conversation. Because they've failed as ethically as they have, all the spin effort is being made to try to say, look, don't worry about it, we've got it all under control, etc., etc. But out in Main Street, particularly Midwest American Main Street, people are realizing, look, sorry, your skin doesn't cut it here, we aren't seeing the gains you're planning to cause with the economy. We're not back at full employment like Paul Krugman says we are. And they go and vote for him in hand grenades and hurl them into Washington. And the French may well do the same thing with Marine Le Pen is how he may do the same thing with Beppe Grillo. The Dutch are about to do it in March.
Right.
So this is really a case of saying, forget your spin, guys. It's the real world calling you through the mechanism as foolish as might be called democracy.
What you're doing over there is admirable, and we wish you all the luck. And anyone in the UK or around the world who wants to give you some support in what you're doing, because you're trying to bring some rationality into the argument. Look, get Steve Keen, look up Steve Keen, follow Steve Keen, give all your maximum support. Check out his books, the Debunking Economics book. Finally, just to give you another example of this, J.P. Morgan has so much money they're going to return it to their investors via stock buybacks. So this is after all these banks got bailed out, after they were exempt from all rule of law, after they committed massive fraud, in J.P. Morgan's case, probably none greater. They're going to take all the money that was given to them, buy back their own stock. And so shareholders are going to get rich, but they've done nothing to help the economy, Steve.
Yeah, the QE's actually helped finance this, because when you pump all this money into firms like insurance companies and so on,
Ja. That was it for today. Tja.